Did the story of Jesus change by the time the Gospels were written? Have you ever played telephone? You know, the game in which one person whispers a sentence to someone else. That person whispers what she or he hears to the next person in the circle, and so on. At the end, the first person and the last person reveal their sentences, and everyone laughs at how much the sentence changed between the first and last communicators. According to New Testament critic Dr. Bart Ehrman, this is precisely what happened to the earliest stories about Jesus. Dr. Ehrman asserts that the stories about Jesus would end up radically changed. Stories were changed with what would strike us today as reckless abandon, Ehrman claims. They were modified, amplified, and embellished, and sometimes they were made up. But are Dr. Ehrman's claims true? Did the earliest Christians actually change stories with reckless abandon? As it turns out, historical evidence from the 1st century AD simply doesn't support Dr. Ehrman's reconstruction. How 1st century oral history functioned. To begin with, there is a vast difference between how oral history would fare in today's world and how accurately people in the ancient world might have preserved oral tradition. People in today's digital world, surrounded by high levels of literacy and easy access to recording technologies, are accustomed to recording important information in written or visual form. So, most people today probably would have a tough time maintaining consistent, reliable oral history for more than a few months, given that they rely on technology. This is not the case in the ancient world, especially among the Jews, as important teachings were told and retold in rhythmic, repetitive patterns so that people could memorize key truths. As a result, it was possible for a rabbi's oral teachings to remain amazingly consistent from one generation to the next. These rabbinic patterns of rhythm and repetition are present throughout Jesus' teachings. For example, the word blessed begins each line of the Beatitudes, and Jesus repeats the phrases, "You have heard it said," and "But I say to you" in the Sermon on the Mount. Such patterns are distinct features of ancient oral traditions. What's more, there is evidence that it wasn't only Jesus' teachings that circulated orally. It seems that brief summaries of the essential events of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection circulated in the same way. Let's look at one example of how oral history was passed from one group of Christians to another. A short time after Jesus died on the cross, a consistent oral account of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus emerged from eyewitnesses of these events. So, where can you find this oral history? It's found in the New Testament, in the writings of Apostle Paul. While dealing with some theological controversies in the city of Corinth, St. Paul recalled and recorded an oral account of Jesus' resurrection. St. Paul's primary purpose in preserving these words was to remind the Corinthians of the truth that he had proclaimed among them 3 years earlier, which was around the year 50 after Christ. Yet, there are clues in St. Paul's words that show how quickly an oral account of Jesus' resurrection emerged among his first followers, and how consistent the tradition remained as it circulated. Here's what St. Paul said to the Corinthians, "For I handed over to you what I also received, that the Messiah died on behalf of our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by the Cephas, then the 12. Then he was seen by more than 500 brothers at once. Then he was seen by James, then by all the apostles." So, how can scholars know that these words actually came from an early oral history? Well, St. Paul introduced this summation with 2 Greek words that clearly indicated it was oral tradition. These 2 Greek words are paradidomi, which means handed over, and paralambano, which means received. Ancient readers understood these 2 words, when used together, imply that the writer was quoting words that he or she intended to become oral tradition. A fixed tradition emerged less than 36 months after Jesus' crucifixion, near the place of his death, at a time when Jesus' first followers and family members were still living. It is therefore unlikely that the earliest Christians recklessly changed these traditions. Otherwise, how could St. Paul, writing 3 years after he first visited Corinth, have said to the Corinthians immediately before he quoted this oral history that he is reminding them about the good proclamation that I proclaimed to you? For St. Paul to have made such a statement, he must have proclaimed a similar tradition in each place that he visited, and there's every reason to believe that this same tradition was the one that St. Paul heard in Jerusalem, only months after Jesus' death. So, is Dr. Ehrman correct when he implies that the story of Jesus resembles the telephone game? The historical evidence suggests the precise opposite. Within months of Jesus' death, a consistent oral account of Jesus' resurrection emerged among his followers. What's more, this tradition did not change from person to person. Unlike a game of telephone gone terribly wrong, the tradition remained relatively unchanged throughout the first 2 decades of Christian faith.